When I really pull back and consider, okay, what were the things that dug me into such a hole in that 21 prep? I mean, the biggest one was escalating cardio to a point that very quickly I couldn't recover from it. So, I mean, cardio was moving up at a very fast rate on account of the coach giving me the option. I'm hungry. I like food. Like, I'm very hungry. Hunger is dysregulated. I want to be adherent. So can we just keep the food in? So cardio was pushed up. At the time, I wasn't doing stairs. I was doing incline treadmill. So, I mean, my heart rate was still pretty high because I was at 15%. But frankly, like having that luxury to decide, I didn't have the knowledge. I didn't have the foresight to be like, ooh, yeah, like eventually there's a point in which training will be impacted from this. And every training session, like moving forward, every training session is going to be that much harder and going to do less and less for me from a muscle retention standpoint, which then leads you into a bigger problem. Luckily, I had a lot of DHEA in place. So, I mean, like 100 milligrams DHEA, my test was sitting nicely. It was at like 70, 78 nanograms per deciliter. It was good. But that in itself, like maybe that offered some kind of like muscle retentive coverage, but at the same time, just the fact that my training performance over the course of several months was going down, like it was declining. And like, I mean, really like Shane deferred to me for training. He's like, do what you're doing. Do what you're doing is working. Like, don't change anything. Like I know other clients of his have gotten training programs and like, okay, I didn't get one from him. So I was just like going in, I'm like fucking doing so much volume, just anything to get a pump, to try to push what I thought was heavy loads at the time. But I was buried in the amount of fatigue that had accumulated thus far because of the cardio, because of the fact that even initially, even if we say like conservatively, okay, middle of February, middle of March, middle of April, middle of May. So that's 1 pound a week. But frankly, like, I don't think it wasn't middle of February. It really like, I know like, gosh, Junior USA's early May. Yeah. Like I've done the math before and I'm like, there's no way without being in like a 800 to 1200 calorie deficit on average, obviously 1,000 calorie deficit a day, that I would have been ready in time. And that really was, what irked me when I reflect back. I'm like, oh, like this was never going to work. And it wasn't like hard to come to that conclusion. Like it literally is it's simple math. This was always going to be something that we had to rush into. And I remember my birthday was, so my birthday, a week out, I was like telling, Patrick, I'm like, my tie-ins are not in. Like, I don't feel confident about where I'm at. I just like, I know I'm really lean, like my core, my upper body, sure, but my tie-ins aren't there. Like, and I think at the time, gosh, I know I was over 125. Like there was a point early May where I was like 127 and I still had an additional 5 pounds to lose over the course. Like I want to say like 2 weeks to 10 days, something like that. And it was so defeating. And it was the stress then of going into the show and trying to be like, okay, well, you had 5 months to, well, I guess not, because you had 4 months to get ready for this show. Like what happened? It's not like you just knew May 1st, like you were doing the show 2 weeks later. And that to me, like that was a guilt and shame thing that like I felt like I needed to bear, even though it's not helpful. I just like, it felt very embarrassing to be like, damn, like I busted my ass and it wasn't enough. Like it wasn't good enough. And then the stress of wondering, what is this going to translate to on stage? Like, what is this going to translate to in terms of placing? And I've talked about this like in several podcasts, some of my own, some others, about how like, honestly, going into that show, I lacked a lot of confidence. And it was because I knew I wasn't ready in time. And I knew that like everything that I needed to do on stage to place well felt like it was a compensation. Whereas if I had been like as lean as I needed to be, let's say May 1st, 2 weeks before the show, well, then we could have eased up on the cardio. Guys, it was like the Thursday before. I was like at the gym doing 90 minutes, 2 hours of cardio, somewhere in the mix of that. But like all of peak week, like I was doing so much cardio, I was eating so little. And I'm like, the fuck? Like, oh my God, we had so much time. Like, what happened? 22 from week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. I was constantly pivoting based on what was happening in real time, based on how recovery was, based on how high or how fast hunger was escalating. Yes, I dropped food. I went from an average of 15, went from an average of like 1620 down to like, I think 1500, something like that. Then down to 1400. And like collectively, I was like, okay, like this is what feels like kind of aggressive. But at the same time, I'm doing 30 minutes of cardio 7 days a week. Like I can coast there for a little bit. Like I'm probably not going to have to go to 60 minutes to get things to move if I control food, which is going to be a little bit more accurate in driving that deficit. I felt good. Like I felt good about like adding in the non-androgenic PDs. I'm like, okay, like fat loss isn't moving as quickly as I'd like. But at the same time, like I took a trip to Texas for like 5 days in February. So within the first month, I was still, I was on track, but like obviously discrepancies in different food sources. I had the trip to Tulum at the end of March, I think. That was like 4 or 5 days, which, really did stress me out. But at the same time, I was like, okay, like I know that even with these things, even with these what seem like very big obstacles at this point, I am still much closer and I still feel more prepared than I did at any point throughout my 21 prep. So I'm like, okay, like even if I start to stall, let's just use that stall. Even if I start to see that the rate of loss is slower, okay, well, I can continue to escalate cardio. And like at my peak, I was doing 60 minutes, 7 days a week, but it wasn't like 60 minutes of 15% incline. Like there were times at the point where it was getting up really, really high, brought the incline back down. Speed was about 3 miles an hour. Like this is a much different modality of cardio versus something like Stairmaster or doing like any kind of HIIT training, HIIT cardio. And frankly, like what I was able to see is even though I had these travel arrangements, like I had these travel plans, I still like went into, did Night of Champions. That was like about the same time. So May 15th, got to the point where I was like, okay, early, middle of April, about a month out, I'm like, I'm close. Like I'm already in like the 126, 127. Like I can still push it from here. And that was a really good feeling because I knew at the time, I'm like, like a year ago, this is where I was starting peak week. And I did not look this way. Like I did not, I was so tired and like fatigue was so high. And largely this was coming from intrinsically, I was like, I'm not ready. I have put forth this amount of effort and I'm not where I need to be. Like, what did I do wrong? To be able to have, I would say really the opposite experience, the complete, a complete 180 from that, where I was able to be like, yeah, I am a month out and I have plenty of time. And if something does go wrong, if I do get sick, if I get injured, like I still have an appropriate amount of tools at this point. Yes, I've used some of them, but I have some tools in the bank that I can cash in for. And I can be like, okay, yeah, like we're going to dig a little bit. And going into that show, like, yes, I was nervous and I was like, I wonder how I'm going to do. And like the girls look a lot bigger and I'm bringing a different shape, but like this is an improved look. It's way too lean for what it needed to be. But for the level of muscularity I had, it was good. It was very good. I was very proud of my performance that show, despite getting 7th, despite not placing as well. I was better prepared with my posing. I felt more confident in like the peaking approach. I felt like, okay, even though these things aren't perfect, because like that's the thing, I look back at pictures, I'm like, oh, like I wish I had done this differently. Like, okay, I wish my the tan was like a disaster. It was so muddy dark and there was like so much glitter in like the coat. But like honestly, looking back at that show, I was so happy with the process. I was so happy with the approach I took, because like ultimately this is something that like it goes against the idea of like, no, I'm competitive and like I care about the bottom line and like I get it. Okay, fucking relax. But you have to remember what we're doing. We're in a sport that is highly subjective. There is not a means in which people can be judged truly on an equal playing field because of structure, because of age, and like I'm talking about like in the open category, but like truly there is so much that is subjective, even in like, okay, it's not the same athletes every show. Some of the judges, they're very insistent, like, no, like we're all aligned. Yeah, like, yes, I believe that they're aligned, but it doesn't mean that there aren't discrepancies judge to judge, East Coast to West Coast to Midwest to South. Like, I mean, there are discrepancies in what wins. And that is largely based on who shows up. And it's based on like that person who shows up, and whether the judges like that look on them, or whether they're like, Corey, it's a little much. Like, why did you come like this? So at the end of the day, like remembering, okay, this is a very subjective sport. All you can do is show up extremely prepared. Yes, like adhering to, sure, the criteria, if you want to say that, but it really is bringing the best you. I'm hesitant to say like move away from the criteria. That's not at all what I'm saying. It's not what I'm saying, but ultimately you have to work with what you can bring to stage. And if that can resemble what the criteria ask for, amazing. But frankly, for some people, like even just bringing their best like that's what they need to do. And if that is being like overly conditioned, okay, well, like you don't have the muscularity. This is a better look than showing up, let's say, softer. Yeah, like I can get on board with that. I think you have to remember that like there's a lot that comes from just being in the sport, being put under this amount of stress for this kind of duration. You learn a lot about yourself. I've learned so much about myself through being in the sport of bodybuilding. I've learned so much about having like forcing myself to get up on stage. Like, believe it or not, I just stage fright, public speaking. That's always been something that has really, really been hard for me to get over. And getting up and like being like in a suit and stuff, and like having to display your physique and being there paying money. Suffering, yes, suffering, it's fucking hard, suffering for several months, in and out of the gym, like 24 hours, like you're in a position where you're making decisions. Does this bring a better physique and overall potential outcome to stage? Yes, doing that for several months at a time. Ultimately, to be told, like, here's what we think you could do better. Like, yes, beautiful X, Y, and Z. Yes, you did this good, but here's why we can't award you better placing. That part is out of your control. All you can do is become, as welcoming to the feedback, while also keeping a very careful lens on how it applies to you and what it might actually mean. But remember that like this ultimately, it can be something that allows you to develop several skills within your umbrella of like personal growth. But the placing, that is one component. It doesn't tell the full story. It doesn't cover the intangibles and what you go through in a contest prep. So like I think that yes, contest prep, it can be very beneficial. You can gain a lot from it if you are ready to gain a lot from it. There's a lot of people who don't gain anything from contest prep and they leave feeling slighted. They feel like they were robbed. And I think this is even more telling, when you have someone who handles the placing and when the placing is different than what they were hoping for, and they handle it poorly. They're very vocal that they feel like they deserved better placing. Ultimately, you gotta like have good sportsmanship and remember like what we're doing is very silly. Like we're creating artificial stress, an artificial environment for us to suffer, and like that's a privilege. And like, yeah, I know like people they kind of live in one camp or the other. They're like, okay, like the sport is dumb, or no, the sport is everything. And I'm not saying, I'm not really joining either here. This sport is not everything to me. This is a very small part of my identity. Sport is not dumb. I'll poke fun, and I love going in on some of the sillier parts of the sport because, like, fucking come on, lighten up. But if you want to gain something from it, if you want to use it as a means to push yourself, you absolutely can. And I encourage you to do that if you've kind of like peaked in terms of what you've been able to get through just, I don't know, recreationally modifying, altering your body composition, etc. I think it could be a good opportunity, be a good way to challenge yourself.